Okay, here we go. Hello, I'm Greg Harrison with USDA Market News Service here in St. Joe, Missouri with your national feeder cattle summary this week. Feeders this week traded in a wide and very uneven price trends and ranges for calves and yearlings. Starting early this week, most of the trade was steady to $5 higher to steady to $5 lower. Then at midweek, we've seen a lot of calves and yearlings trading $8 to $10 lower in many areas, and there was even some places where it was 12 to 15 lower depending on where it was at. But for the most part this week, trading significantly lower than it has been the last few weeks. Some of the best prices we've seen this week were in the northern plains, where many calves and yearlings selling long strings and load lots coming off grass, selling with very good demand. Several things happened this week in news this week. Over the last week, we've seen live cattle and feeder cattle futures trading with great price volatility as buyers and sellers have had to remain cautious as losses on the live cattle and feeder cattle futures on Tuesday and Wednesday of this week pretty much imploded, with mostly limit losses in the feeder cattle pit on Wednesday. And this has been accelerated by a heavy sell-off in the stock market since going back to last Thursday and continued into this week. And on the Dow on Wednesday at one point had lost 460 points, but it rebounded to close 173 points lower. And a lot of that over growing concerns about economic growth in the EU and Asia, and that's caused many market participants to sell off assets and be in a very defensive mood. And that defensive mood is carried over into the cattle futures and many other commodities falling into that category. Also, escalating concerns over the Ebola virus spreading further in the U.S. keeps investors nervous as well. But despite these losses, packers on Wednesday did not exploit the sharply lower futures, as fat cattle traded mostly steady at 164 in the southern plains and in Nebraska, and even had a few sales back at 165, and dress sales were traded steady at 258. Hopefully, with the fat cattle trading holding on to steady money this week in the face of these adversities, it can stabilize cattle traders' fears. On Thursday of this week, we've seen that the live cattle and feeder cattle futures did stabilize and close with near limit gains in live cattle and limit gains on feeder cattle, and kind of rocked that bear back this week. And a lot of that was due to the steady trade that we've seen in the fat cattle market. So despite lower markets this week in the feeder cattle, we still are at all-time highs, and many areas we're just back to prices that we had 2 to 3 weeks ago. And looking at some feeder prices this week, on Monday in Torrington, Wyoming, they sold 170 head of fancy steer calves, selling with a weighted average weight of 416 pounds, and they sold with a weighted average price of a little over $4 a pound. And in Aberdeen, South Dakota, at the Hub City Livestock Market on Wednesday, they sold 497 head of steers weighing between 780 and 797 pounds with a weighted average weight of 791 pounds, and they sold with a weighted average price of $252.75. So we're looking at some winter wheat planting is well ahead of schedule. It's at 68% completed, and that should have wheat pastures pretty much assured for this fall grazing. And for the most part, the long-term tight supplies, they should keep any pressure in the feeder cattle market, pretty much should keep it on a short-term downside. This week we just seen a lot of corrections come back, but for the most part the market still remains very good. It's still at record prices, and there's still a lot of good fundamentals in this market, whether, like we talked about here, corn prices being at a 5-year low. A lot of good pasture conditions are in very good shape in most areas for fall grazing. A lot of hay, so there's still a lot of good demand on these feeders. Just had a setback this week, and hopefully we'll see if we can get some gains back next week on this market. And I want to thank you for listening, and be back next week.